Hello, everyone, and welcome to part 2 of our lecture on Chapter 7, Data Collection for Quantitative Research. In part 1 of our lecture, we talked about how data collection in research can be done, the different methods for data collection, especially in experimental, quasi-experimental, and then we started our discussion on data collection and surveys. So for part 2, we're going to continue our discussion on on data collection in surveys, and then we're going to talk about the different methods of data collection. So we left off on our data collection and surveys with step 5, which was really looking at different tips for writing effective questions in questionnaires to measure your variables of interest. And again, remembering that your variables are the operationalized versions of your constructs. So step 6 in creating data collection and surveys is to organize your questions in a manner that attracts and holds the participants' attention in your study. So keep in mind that when participants are bored by the questions, it can change their attitude towards the entire questionnaire. So you want to make sure that you're asking questions that the participant is interested in. If they're interested in the topic, they're more likely to read the question in greater detail and maintain a better sort of perspective and attitude about the survey or questionnaire in general. You also need to keep in mind that just naturally, as people are going through an entire survey, their attention may decrease as they answer each question. And as a questionnaire goes on and as a survey goes on, participants may be less willing to answer accurately in the questions that you ask. So you want to organize your questions in a way that will allow for that natural sort of decrease in attention. It's also best practice to ask demographic questions at the end of a survey, after all of your attention requiring questions. This is important because participants might be more willing to answer questions in the survey more accurately if they have not yet exposed their identity. You also want to make sure that you are asking questions in a logical order, making sure that the questions make sense, how they're grouped together, and that the topics don't vary from one to the other. So you don't want to go from asking someone's age as the first question, then asking a bunch of questions about cannabis use, and then start asking about their sex assigned at birth and their gender identity, and then start asking them questions about things like depression and their mental health, and then start asking questions about their income. You don't want to space things out. You want them to flow logically from topic to topic. And as researchers, you always want to be wary of using scale measurements because participants may start skipping questions and selecting the same rating repetitively. So if you have an entire questionnaire and every single question in that questionnaire is on a scale from 1 to 5, where would you rate yourself? And the options never change from 1 to 5, the participants not only can get bored with that order, but they can also start skipping questions pretty easily, or they may just start saying 3 for everything. It's all threes, because they just want to move on, because the more questions like that you have grouped together, the more monotonous they get and repetitive. And then step 7 is for you to create some sort of answer scale. So it's important to keep in mind that a scale needs to range from the maximum of a concept to the minimum of that same concept when you are creating an answer scale. So if you are looking at a question and the options might be completely satisfied to completely unsatisfied, that would be ranging on the maximum and the minimum of the same concept. You wouldn't want it to be completely satisfied to completely unhappy or to completely sad, because those might be different ranges. They might be related, but if they're different, they might be confusing to participants. And also, depending on the purpose of the question, consider the options of having even or odd numbered response options. So if you have a set of odd numbered response options, there's an automatic middle option that could be considered as like neutral for your clients or your participants. But if you have an even number of responses, there's no middle option, and it creates a forced choice for your participants, which can be really helpful depending on what you are investigating, and the purpose of the question that you're asking. So if you want to force participants to take a stand, have an even number of options available to them. And you want to make sure that your answers are inclusive of all options and also are gradually progressive from one to another. So your question needs to include all available options. If you don't want to list out every option, having an open form question where the clients can write in their response is helpful, but you also want to make sure that your answer options gradually progress from one to another. They are consistent, they're on a similar scale or at least in a similar direction. So a good example of this is you don't want participants to answer questions about their level of depression and have like 2 of those, and then 2 questions about cannabis, and then 3 questions about depression and 1 about cannabis, and 4 more about meaning in life, and then 3 about alcohol use. You want them to generally just relate to one another. Have all the cannabis related questions and answers together. All of the depression related questions and answers together. All of the meaning in life questions and answers related together. You want them to progress naturally. And the final step in data collection with surveys is for you as a researcher to conduct a pilot study as a way to evaluate the survey instrument that you're using. So a pilot study is a specific way of testing an instrument with a small group of participants that allows you as a researcher to get feedback from that small group of participants on the instrument. So a good example of this is if you are wanting to do a survey with all of the CSU students in the undergraduate psychology department, you might pilot this study with like members of a research lab. So maybe you ask all of the undergraduate students in Mark's lab and all the undergraduate students in Brad's lab, and you have them take the survey, and then they give you feedback, questions that didn't make sense, things that they were confused by, just the order that was clunky, how long it took. That's a pilot test. It's piloting the survey in a small group of participants, getting feedback from those participants, and then using that information to improve your survey before it goes live to your targeted population of interest. Pilot studies can give you as a researcher a sense of how much time it takes your participants to participate in your study. And it then can make it easier for you to recruit participants. If you tell people on a survey that it's going to take 15 minutes and they sit down and it takes 45 minutes, word's going to get around and people aren't going to want to participate. But if you can accurately advertise, you're more likely to get participants. You can also determine any issues that might come up in understanding questions, the sequence of questions, as well as just questions that are uncomfortable as a participant to answer, so you can start brainstorming how to mitigate that discomfort. You can also see that a lot of times you're going to get suggestions on how to potentially improve your survey. So this can mean your participants volunteering information around terms or language that will best convey accurate information on the topic of interest. And also, as a researcher, when you do a pilot test, you get to test data entry and you get to correct any problems that could be caused during the collection of data. So you get to see like, oh, this piece didn't make sense, or oh, I have these questions coded in a way that is confusing. So when I'm trying to run analyses at the end, I have a lot more work to do. You can correct it during the pilot stage as opposed to waiting until the end of your data collection. And we'll talk more about the coding of data and data entry in chapter 9. So that's data collection and surveys. And we've talked about data collection and surveys as well as experiments and quasi-experiments, and that's just general categories of data collection. But there are different ways that you can actually go about collecting data. And the method of data collection that you use is focused on the process of transforming raw information that you get from your participants into some measurable unit that you can later analyze. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about the method of data collection. How you are actually getting information from your clients and transforming it into a format that you can actually work with it and analyze it. And researchers are actively involved in data collection and should follow specific rules on the best practices to systematically and professionally collect the information. And that is part of what you do in the method section of a research study, is creating that systematic, professional, stepwise formation or procedure that you are going to follow in order to collect data. And a lot of times that procedure, those steps that you take, are informed by other researchers who have done something similar, or maybe even by your primary investigator, the faculty advisor on the project, or even just agency policies. As researchers, there are multiple ways that we can collect that data, and one of those is personally collecting data from the clients. As researchers, you may approach people and individually ask them questions or have them read and answer questions on their own. And this is a form of personally collecting information from our clients. It's going up and physically being in the same space as the client and gathering the information. Another alternative for personally collecting information is by distributing written questionnaires and collecting them after completion. So going in and being there while the participant answers questions, handing them the actual questionnaire, and then picking it back up and leaving with it. Some of the advantages to in-person data collection is that as a researcher, you can observe the body language of your participants, you can record impressions that you have of them, and you can keep records of additional information that's not included in the questionnaire. So this is really popular in assessments, because if you are doing a test for someone that has a big behavioral component, such as like ADHD assessments in children, you can take observations of the child and see how often they got up and moved around the room, how often they needed to be fidgeting while they were answering questions. That sort of information can only be gathered through the personal collection of information. So it's advantageous in that regard. Also, you are more likely to see if a participant is able to fully complete the questionnaire if you do personal data collection. In fact, participants are more likely to complete a questionnaire in its entirety if the researcher is sitting in front of them and watching them. So it's helpful to have that if you are really needing participants to get to the very end of the questionnaire that they're answering. And also, longer questionnaires tend to be easier to complete in person. So if you are face to face with a client or with a participant and they have questions, they're more likely to talk at length to another person about that question, as opposed to if they're just being asked to write long written responses to each question. People are going to get tired and they don't want to do it. But if you tell people, like, yeah, just tell me, they're more likely to sit and answer those questions a little bit easier. To stay on that personal data collection, there are also disadvantages. One of the disadvantages is that it is incredibly cost limited. It is expensive to do personal data collection. It's expensive both in transportation, it can be expensive in resources, but especially it is costly in time. When you are personally collecting data, you have to account for how many participants you can see in one sitting, and then how many times you need to sit in order to get the number of participants that are ideal for you. So if you are doing a survey or a questionnaire or an interview type questionnaire with participants, and the questionnaire takes about 45 minutes, and you can only do one participant at a time, but you need 50 participants total, you're looking at spending many days collecting data nonstop just to get to the amount of people that you need, which again leads to those time constraints. You don't have all the time in the world to do personal data collection all the time, so it can be costly to you. And when we're talking about the cost limitations of personal data collection, you're having to print off every single one of your consent documents, your debriefing forms, your actual questionnaires and having resources. So if people are answering questions by paper and pencil, having the pencils, having extra paper, having any recording devices that you need, it can get to be quite costly very quickly. Which leads to a second type of data collection, which is what we call computer assisted telephone interviewing, which is oftentimes just called CATIE. So, CATIE is used to find the right respondents and sometimes to conduct an interview electronically. So, the way that CATIE works is it can occur in two different ways. The first of those is that you have a phone that will randomly dial numbers, and anytime that someone answers, there will be an automated system that will have a sort of questionnaire, not a questionnaire, but like an introduction to what this survey is about. And based on what the participant hears, if they agree to participate, they are then transferred to an interviewer who will continue the rest of the survey. This is similar to what happens if you call a customer service phone tree and you get an automated voice that says, to get the correct department, listen to the following options. And you select an option until you get to the right department. You select that number, and then it sends you to that department where you can get your questions answered. That's a form of CATIE interviewing. And in psychology, that is just one form where you can have people, the phone will randomly dial people and then send them out to the phone tree from there. The other option is that you as a researcher can completely reach out to participants by phone and then have the participants complete the survey completely online. So in the first option, you as a researcher are still doing the data collection by answering questions after the participant gets to you. In the second option of CATIE, the phone randomly dials numbers, gets participants, and then participants partake in the study by answering questions over the phone. So the question might come across and it might say, okay, select 1 for yes, 2 for no. And it asks the question and they have to select 1 or 2. And it goes through all the way through the entire survey. So it's completely automated. The key with research that is CATIE focused is that you as a researcher are still involved in most of the cases, because most often CATIE research is done where the caller is transferred to you as a researcher. And if that happens, all of the interviewers and researchers who are partaking in the study need to be well trained on the study itself. The researcher, the interviewer, needs to be familiar with the content of a study. They need to have a comfortable tone in the way that they communicate with the participants, and they need to make sure that they're using neutral language to avoid hinting at preferred answers with the clients. And the final form of data collection that I want to talk about with y'all is similar to CATIE research, but it's probably the most common that you are familiar with now, and that is virtual data collection. And virtual data collection is really what you think about if you get a URL in the mail from like one of the directors of training in the psych department that says, hey, this research team is asking for participants, and you answer the questions completely online on your computer. That's virtual data collection. And we see that these online surveys have been incredibly popular lately because you can recruit a vast number of participants in a matter of minutes. And you get higher response rates because people can participate in the study when they have time and when they're comfortable. So virtual data collection oftentimes gives much larger sample sizes, which can then lead to additional statistical analyses that can be run with greater power. But virtual data collection is not without its drawbacks. Some of the drawbacks of data collection is that a substantial portion of the population does not have access to the internet. And if you are relying exclusively on virtual data collection, your results cannot be generalized out to the entire population because you're automatically omitting anyone who doesn't have access to the internet. Also, participants who feel strongly about an issue may be more likely to participate in a virtual data collection session, which means that you're more likely to capture the positive and negative extremes of a concept while missing a lot of the responses that will tend towards the middle. So keep that in mind if you are doing exclusive virtually data collection, because you are going to end up with those extremes and less people in the middle. And also, as a researcher, you cannot guarantee the identity of the person who's participating in your survey, in your virtual data collection. So it's important to keep that in mind, that you can never guarantee the identity of someone, nor that their responses are accurate to who they are. You really have to go at their word. And that's just something that you have to think about if you are choosing to use virtual data collection as your method of data collection. So that is where we are going to end our lecture on Chapter 7, and you can join me in the next lecture.